So thank you all for joining. It is approximately 11 o'clock a.m. and this is our first Communities of Practice meeting following the conference. So I want to definitely thank you all for joining. We have a pretty important agenda today because we really need your feedback as we look at the upcoming webinars and training opportunities. We really hope at the end of this meeting today to give you some updates on some things, but also to find out from you who is missing at the table, who are those speakers that we need to have on these upcoming webinars, and also if there are any topics that are missing. So today we're just going to review the CoP webinar and meeting schedule. Dr. Matt Morris is going to do an overview of the physician implicit bias webinar. Dr. Tom Arcury will be covering policy briefs, and Dr. Juarez will discuss opportunities for engagement. We'll have our Q&A, and then any announcements, and particularly on the announcements, we want to find out, are there any conferences that you all are presenting at, or even things that your organizations are doing that we need to be aware of and that we need to share on our social media platforms and website. So what we've done by taking your feedback from the COP meeting, we've developed, in essence, 3 COP calendars. So we have one per focus area. For each of these webinars on the calendar, we're going to invite the entire COP, but then you as the COP members will have the opportunity to select which webinar you want to attend based upon your area of interest and expertise. We felt that this would allow everybody to share their expertise in a very unique way. Our goal on each webinar is to actually have one NCMEDR researcher, one COP member, as well as one national expert from a national organization. So again, we really need you all's feedback as we move forward. So again, 3 speakers per webinar. So here is an overview of the COP calendar that everyone should have received. So today is really the planning meeting. And then if we go through it, you'll see we have the opioid use, and you see the focus area, social determinants of health and health equity, structural vulnerabilities, and kind of go through this. I won't read each one. I'll pause for a second and just ask, based upon these topics, any questions so far?
Yes, this is Reuben Warren. The topic areas and the focus, does it focus mean exclusive, or can the focus be broad? In other words, can it include more than one specific focus?
It can definitely include more than one specific focus.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's actually another screen I can pull up, and it shows like who all the current speakers are. Did you all see that screen that I sent everyone? Mm-hmm. Or would it help you if I pull that up?
It'll help me if you pull it up.
Okay.
It'll help me too.
Okay, give me 1 second. Can you see this new screen that's up?
I can just see part of it.
Yes. It's the 3 slides?
No, it should say Community of Practice webinar series.
Oh, no.
No.
Okay, give me 1 second then. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so this is showing who we currently have. So on today, we saw that one. So the 13th is the one is addressing opioid use disorders among LGBTQ persons through trauma-informed care and behavioral health integration. And then you see who the speakers are for that one. So for that webinar, we actually need a COP member who would be interested in speaking. The next one that comes up on August 20th right here is the social determinants of health and health equity. And so we have the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, Dr. Ramesh, and I've heard from Suzanne Wenzel and Beth Shen about being the COP members on that one. On the 27th, we have the Addressing Structural Vulnerabilities in Healthcare for Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Workers. And Delania Garcia is with the Migrant Clinicians Network, and she'll be the national speaker, but we need a NCMEDR and a COP speaker. The next one comes up on September 10th, which is providing mental health assessments for gender affirming surgery referral letters. The focus is on LGBTQ, and we have the Fenway Institute as the national partner on that one. And then as we come to the next slide, you'll see the next time slot, September 17th, is motivational interviewing for vulnerable populations. And then we've listed the focus area and we need speakers. September 24th, physician implicit bias. We have an NCMEDR speaker, but we need a national partner and a COP member. November 5th is cultural competency. November 12th was cultural competency in street medicine. That is specifically a topic that the COP members requested from the conference, but I have no speaker. You remember how we did those forms and people just wrote topics of interest? That was a topic that was requested. We don't have a speaker. November 19th was a topic that was requested out of all 3 COPs, requested ethics and medical education. So that we don't have a speaker for that one. That's the one, Dr. Warren, I was trying to see if we can get on your calendar, because that was requested out of all 3 focus groups. So we know that's a topic that everyone wants. And then March 29th is the trauma-informed care.
Okay.
So this one was emailed to everyone as well.
Let's have another conversation about that November 19th.
Okay.
Because I think we can put together a good group of folk.
Okay. Very good. Let me go back to my screen share. I'll go back to the presentation.
And
so as you think about those, if you all have any recommendations of speakers, or if you're interested, if you can just follow up and let me know, because you see, we really want to highlight all three speakers for each webinar, but we really need you all's input and expertise to make that possible. And I'm going to go to the next slide.
Send that back out again to be sure I have it.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. And Matt, are you on here?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. This is Matt Morris. I am going to be giving a brief overview of a presentation that I anticipate giving on September 24th on physician implicit bias. So I thought I would just kind of give you an overview of what I hope to talk about, and then I guess if there's any time, maybe you all can give some feedback on if you think I should be emphasizing different things or including other stuff. So I will begin by giving some background on health disparities that are experienced by vulnerable populations, with particular emphasis on LGBTQ patients. And then I will be outlining some of the training deficits that currently exist for medical students on treating these vulnerable populations. Then I will go into describing and defining explicit and implicit bias, and talk about how those different kinds of constructs are measured. I will go into outlining some models of how implicit bias impacts health disparities, and discussing things like how physician implicit bias in particular may affect decision-making in healthcare type settings. And then what I will really spend the bulk of the time doing is summarizing the findings from our systematic review of bias reduction training programs. I'll talk about what effects we found for physician comfort level, explicit attitude change, knowledge of vulnerable populations, and talk about the dearth of evidence really for changes in implicit bias. I will discuss a little bit about what the key components are of the training programs that appear to be successful in changing those different types of constructs. And then what I'll finish up with by doing, I think, is providing a research update. So it's been now over a year, I think, since we completed the review. The manuscript is currently under review, but there has been more work that's been done in this area. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to discuss some of the latest research on that topic, and also to perhaps finish by talking about some opportunities for integrating these findings into medical school training curricula. So that's pretty much what I'll be doing, and happy to hear any thoughts about whether whether I should be emphasizing different things or anything else that I should include.
This is Reuben Warren. It sounds exciting. I have two thoughts for your consideration.
Yes.
Maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, not that long, but a while back, I read a book on the training of Harvard residents, medical school residents. And something that stuck with me that since then was that the author said that Harvard brings in babies and 4 years later graduates baby doctors. And so what that said to me is that there's some things that people bring to the setting, and that may be important as a foundation. A brief overview: who comes to medical school, and what are the implicit bias that they bring to that setting, based upon the class, the gender of those who come. And I think that would be a pretty interesting overview if there's data to suggest what it's about. Even the transition from more men in medical school and health professional school than women, and that transition that suggests there may be some difference in how the bias unfolds. So I don't know if it's data to support it or data to whatever, but it would be, I think, an interesting part of the introduction.
That's a great suggestion, and I'm aware of a little bit of data, but I'll look into that more carefully. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah. Other than that, it sounds quite exciting to me.
So I would add to what Dr. Warren has said about, I'd like to quote about Harvard brings in babies and graduates baby doctors, because I think what's often missing from discussions of explicit and implicit bias is where did it come from, and why is it there, and why does it last? Why is it lasted over time, and particularly associated with certain populations of people? So I think that some contextual kind of understanding of that, although of that, it would be helpful too. And I think more than you get that not from data in the way that we tend to think about data in the health sciences, but from analysis or from the social sciences in terms of how the world is constructed and how reality is constructed in our world, and what purposes do those realities serve.
Okay. Yeah, great. So perhaps some background on social cognitive theories that might inform how bias develops, just as a kind of, as you say, like a contextual understanding before going into the topic. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's more than just an abstract. I think you have to apply it to the history in this country and the history of devalued persons in this country. And you really need to understand that to understand implicit bias and why it's so important to raise it to a level and try to address it.
Right, but basically that's what I'm saying. I'm saying theses like the social construction of reality,
right?
Which then applies to all, and then how reality is socially constructed in all, and then you superimpose an understanding of white supremacy, at least in this country, and how social reality then. How the idea of the notion of the thesis of social reality, how it's constructed, and then.
Yeah, and I think,
it brings in what you're saying, Dr. Juarez, and what Dr. Warren is saying, and what I'm saying to an understanding of where explicit and implicit bias comes from. What's the underpinning?
Okay. And specific to the three vulnerable populations that we're addressing, LGBTQ, and I mean, that's a relatively recent history that there's been a change in that. Going back to, it's not that long ago when being gay or homosexual was treated as a disease or condition that warranted some sort of intervention. With migrant farm workers, the whole issue is based in this immigration policy and attitudes about or perceptions towards who migrant farm workers tend to be. And then with persons experiencing homelessness, the same. It's again sort of the historical way that certain populations have been treated really needs to be at the forefront to understand the importance of it in terms of teaching physicians and other health professionals about why it's so important and how to address it. Because again, that context, that social context really, that's what shapes everyone's attitudes and opinions. And if they haven't received any, I won't say training, but just in their own experience, if they haven't had other perspectives, then that's probably the predominant culture will be what people adapt and bring to the table with them.
Okay. Any other thoughts or suggestions?
So on homelessness, I would also say that it is the case that some populations are way overrepresented among folks who experience homelessness, particularly African Americans and Native Americans. And the historical context there is really strong. I've just been reading a great book called The Color of Law, which outlines the ways that segregation in this country has not merely been de facto, but de jure, that the ways that, for example, African Americans were denied mortgages and entry to public housing. And it just traces the history of federal, state, and local de jure discrimination that set the context for why we have more African Americans experiencing homelessness in particular, as well as the broader ways that our society has been racist and discriminatory. Maybe too much for a session on implicit bias.
Yeah. So all great suggestions. I'm wondering, do you think that for the presentation itself, I should really get into the get into the historical roots of these kinds of biases, or is it more that we need to think about how we're addressing them in the context of bias reduction training programs, or is it both?
See, I wonder all the time with these trainings how it may be, and I was sitting here thinking, so I'm thinking out loud now, so just be patient with me. I often wonder if these implicit bias trainings and diversity trainings that we're painting on a canvas that doesn't have the full understanding. And so is it possible, I'm just wondering out loud, that you can even understand this to a place where you will internalize it to change your behavior if you don't know something about where it comes from and what purposes it serves? As well as, I think, when you know that, then you're really further ahead in changing people's behaviors and then their thoughts and their attitudes. However, I would be the first one to say it's a lot, and I think it would take some real careful thinking about how far you go in it when you're doing a presentation like that, except to draw some consciousness raising about, not awareness, but consciousness raising about it, so that people are inspired to dig a little deeper on that, maybe on their own or secondary training. or further, like we have a program of research, like a program of training?
Yeah, I think that, you know, again, one of the things you're pushing back against is that, you know, people will come in and they, you know, with an attitude that I don't need this, I'm not racist, therefore, you know, bias against different groups, without realizing that, you know, again, that their own perceptions have been shaped by the broader society, and that's really what they just have to get in touch with, is that you know, and so I think it is really critical to at least set the table, you know, by discussing some of the historical context of discrimination. And again, it's not just being homeless or a migrant farmer. It's being, you know, the intersectionality of the conditions that we're talking about, plus race, plus gender, plus, you know, these are things that you know, that also will shape somebody's response or thinking. And so it's really, it is a complex issue, and one that I think at this point, you know, the only thing we want to do is really increase the ability of people to be aware of both the broader conditions, social conditions, and begin to think about how that might shape their own beliefs or way that they react or respond to different groups of people.
I would push back a little further, not the social conditions, but the structural barriers.
Yeah.
And therefore, if one could focus on a structural barrier, then they can see over time that the limitation of that training, but it brings an awareness to what system they're actually in. So I think, you know, the highlighting, not in detail, but just talking about the structural circumstance that create the social conditions that create the bias. That's a lot in a short time, but I think if we don't do that, then it becomes, I know better, I just have no reason to do better.
Right. I think these programs, the better programs that I've read about will typically sort of provide some psychoeducation about how, even though, you know, you may think that you're not biased, and your explicit bias may not necessarily be something that you're concerned about, that your implicit bias may still be there and may still be causing problems. And then these training programs then link that to, you know, data on the ways in which these biases might impact physician behavior, resulting in health disparities. But what I haven't seen is what you all have been talking about, which is really providing that sort of, you know, where do we trace this back to, developmentally, historically, et cetera. I'm not sure that that's a part of those programs. So I'll have to read more about that, and I'll try to weave that into the presentation.
And I think the other piece to it, Matt, is, and I'm reflecting on the videos that Catherine did with the for the LGBTQ representatives. And one of them in particular said that, you know, again, that if you go to you go to your healthcare provider and you get a bad feeling, that you may not go back to a healthcare provider for whatever condition it is that you know, or just as a rule, that the experience becomes a negative one and an adverse one, so that you know, prevents people from wanting to go back into that sort of setting. So right. I think that's really the importance of why people need to understand it's you know, it's beyond just getting good care. It's getting, you know, it's just being able to establish a trusting relationship so that somebody feels comfortable in seeking care. And if they get a bad experience, that may generalize to, you know, in turn other health conditions, other healthcare providers or settings.
Right.
The experience is worse than the condition.
Yes.
So, and that all too often is the case. I'd rather live with this disease and go back and deal with this provider.
Yes. You're on mute, Catherine.
I said, thank you all so much. I think that gives Matt some amazing ideas, and we look forward to that upcoming webinar. If you have any additional feedback, thoughts, or suggestions, you can send them to him directly, or you can send them to me, and I'll forward them to him. So thank you all so much. We're going to go to the
Dr. Brown, don't get us started, because you can't stop us.
I was waiting for somebody to take a breath. I was coming in. So we're going to go to the next session today, and we asked Tom to cover policy briefs for us. So he's going to give us an overview.
So thank you very much. Over the last 8 or 10 years, our research program has produced about 16 policy briefs so that we can take our research and make it more available to those who make decisions. This in some ways started because my good colleague, Melinda Wiggins, who's the Executive Director of Student Action with Farm Workers, said, Tom, your papers are really important, but they're so academic and so boring to read. So could you make something a little simpler for us to understand?
Tom, I was going to tell you that too. Your paper.
That's okay. I find them quite exciting. Anyway, so but what is a policy brief? And I've looked, I've developed these, and then I went back and looked into what's available on the web and in other publications. You end up with a short document that presents the findings and recommendations of research to a non-specialized audience. It's a medium to explore an issue and distill lessons learned from the research, and a vehicle to provide policy advice. But then there's some disagreement out there as to what those things mean. So what's short? I think 2 pages, the front and back of a single sheet is short. Others think it's 4 to 8 pages. Is it 1,500 words or 2,400 words? So you have to worry about that. The next question is, should it be a neutral statement just presenting facts and options? Or should you have a stated policy position at the end of it? So there are different perspectives on that. And then you have to understand, who are you providing policy advice to? Is it congressmen or legislative folks? Is it their staff? Is it community leaders who want your input as to how they can approach regulators and get things changed? So you have to take those things into account. Next slide, please.
Yeah,
why do we use policy briefs? Well, policy audience is often too busy to read these things. They don't have the technical skills. So we're all scientists. We produce things, and as they say, they're pretty boring. But the parts that are there, we know need to be there to pass peer review, but the policy folks don't necessarily need that. So we can get that out of there. And often they're just not interested to read a full research report. I might find that titillating, but other people don't. Now, let's move, if we can jump down 2 slides. So this is a recent policy brief, and I just wanted to show this to you quickly, that we did on mental health among Latina farm workers, Latinas and farm worker families and Latino farm workers. And just to go over what's in there, we give a summary, we tell about why it's important, we say a little bit about the research, very little. Notice that's only about 6 lines. We summarize some results, and then we make recommendations. I am of the school that one should actually make a recommendation based on what you find. Now, if you could go back up, I wanted people to see that. Now, like I said, we've produced, I think, 16 of these things, and they cover everything from child labor through alcohol abuse, heat stress, and housing, and pesticide exposure. So they cover a number of different things. Issues that we have found in our research or addressed in our research. Now the question is, for this group and for this program is, do we want to develop some policy briefs, and how do we proceed with that? Now I think we are under a mandate to produce some policy briefs, and so we need to consider that as we move forward. And I break down the process of developing a brief into a series of questions, which we can address as we move forward. So if we were to develop a policy brief, we first have to decide what's the policy that we want to address. You know, how controversial an issue is involved in this policy? What are the positions of different stakeholders concerning the policy, and are we raising a totally new issue? So if we're going to come up with a policy statement for medical schools around implicit bias, is this something new? Is this something medical schools, dental schools, nursing schools are already addressing? And what are the different positions there? And so we need to consider that. Now, the next question is, who's the audience? Now, as I say, most of what I produce is out of a community-based participatory research perspective in which I'm producing policy briefs for my community partners and advocates to use. But when we're doing this, we have to make sure that we know what is the knowledge about the topic for our audience and what is their educational attainment and literacy. So we have to make sure that it is addressed, it is educationally as well as culturally appropriate. And again, what's the position of the person? Are we going to legislators or their staff? Are we going to nonprofits and NGOs or government agencies? Are we going straight to citizens? And then there's a conflict in doing this, whether we really want to work with the policymakers versus the citizens or residents. What are the key points that we want to make? What is our hook? Is it our hook that mental health is a problem among Latinas who are in farm worker families, and here's what we have to do to address that? What is the source of the information? Is it an article or a research report? We have to know where it's coming from. And is it a neutral versus a policy position? Similarly, what is the quality of the information? Now, we tend to base all our policy briefs on peer-reviewed articles. If an article doesn't pass peer review, we don't do much more with it. But there's a lot of gray literature out there that we need to pay attention to. It's not getting into the peer-reviewed literature. So one could argue that all the reports that Human Rights Watch or Southern Poverty Law Center produce are all gray literature. They're not peer-reviewed, but they have a lot of important information, and should we use that when we're doing a policy brief? So for me, when I'm doing these, I often base a policy brief on a single article. On the article, the policy brief I just showed you that's on the next slide, it's actually based on a series of papers that we've produced over a number of years, which have led to the conclusion that mental health is an important issue among women in farm worker families or female farm workers, and this is something that has to come to the top of clinicians providing care to this population. You also have to be considerate of what we call the scenario of use. How is the policy brief going to be used? Now, we developed these, and when we first developed them, we expected that our advocacy partners would take these briefs and hand them to legislators or legislative staff. That's not what's happened. What they do is use these not as handouts, but as talking points. They use them to construct letters to legislators or through their staff. They use them in doing presentations. They very seldom give them out. So you have to know who will be the presenter in that situation. Fine. Then we want to know what is the best format. Now, when I was a Cub Scout leader, and yes, I was a Cub Scout leader, I had my own den, we were taught that we should keep it simple and make it fun. And that's what we try to do with all of our policy briefs. We try to get out as many numbers and as much of the scientific detail and come up with just the results. We try to use graphics and tables. The policy brief I showed you doesn't have those, but most of ours do. We use photographs. There is a photograph in there of a woman who we know and her children, and she is a wife of a farm worker. We pay close attention to literacy and language, and we're concerned about font size of all things, because if you want to make something 2 pages long, but then you put it down to a font size of 6, you're not going to have a very good audience. You have to keep the font size up where it's readable. And a lot of these issues of structure and what you're going to put into it, of course, reflect the length of the policy brief that you want to use. So again, we try to keep ours to 2 pages, but it is dependent. So if we look at what we do in a policy brief, and if you go to the next slide, the components we include, is we try to have a title that's descriptive. We have an executive summary so that if you only read that first paragraph, you'll get a good bit of what we say in the rest of the 2 pages. We try to give some background on the matter. Why is this important? Why do we care about mental health among anybody, much less among farm worker women? What did we do to get data? And again, we lay out 2 studies that we did. And again, each of those studies has produced multiple papers. And so you're not really getting the details of the design there. And then what we found, and as simple as possible, put some information in some comparison, and then we make, from our perspectives, concrete recommendations. What should clinicians do here? And also we call for more research because that's what we're in business to do. On this slide, you'll also see a reference, and if y'all are interested, I can get you a PDF of this. We wrote this idea of doing policy brief up, and we did publish it in a journal. It's been peer-reviewed in Programs and Community Health Partnership, and this gives a little bit more detail about how we've developed policy briefs.